Jacob Bell is a philosopher and writer. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy from the American Public University and is doing his Masters of Research in Philosophy at the University of Wales, Trinity, St. David. The working title for his dissertation is a Phenomenological Analysis of the Structures of Meaningfulness. Jacob's primary academic interests include phenomenology and existentialism. So Jacob, that's like the formal definition or the formal bio, let's say. Would you want to give an introduction yourself, mate?
Um, you know, I, I'll give a less technical introduction and say, I like thinking about weird things, and philosophy is the perfect discipline that allows me to do that. Um, but yeah, no, I don't have anything else to add.
A bachelor of weird things. That sounds good. Sounds very much like what we're all interested in, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, so let's jump into it. For starters, maybe let's get some definitions out of the way to, lay some groundwork. So within your fields of interest, some let's say terms would be philosophy of mind, phenomenology, and existentialism. So maybe you could give us a bit of a elucidation on what those terms are, how they interconnect and correlate, but also how they are a part of a broader philosophical framework or a school of thought.
Yeah, so philosophy of mind, I guess I understand that as a branch of philosophy that just kind of investigates things like mind and consciousness, which I mean, to be honest, is a really bad way of defining the topic because you don't get any further than the phrase itself. So I guess to go into it a little bit further, um, if anybody is familiar with philosophy, they've probably heard of things like physicalism and idealism and dualism. Those are like those are metaphysical theories, but they're prevalent and they're always being discussed in philosophy of mind. So you might find people in philosophy of mind working on trying to discern whether the mind is a physical thing or if it's a separate substance. Or if maybe it's fundamental, like maybe a panpsychist sort of take on it. So those are like some of the more popular topics that philosophers of mind are working in. I guess something maybe a little more specific than that. You could think about ideas of perception. What is what I'm perceiving the real world, or is it a representation that kind of plays into philosophy of mind and metaphysics more broadly, which then feeds into ideas like is the world a mental construct or is it independent of us? So then you start to get into topics of realism. And so it all kind of feeds back into each other. But I think as far as contemporary philosophy goes, or philosophy of mind goes, really what you're seeing, or at least what I see 90% of the time, are people trying to um, struggle with where to place consciousness as far as in a physical world, in a mental world, in a dualistic world, or as something fundamental.
So one thing I've learned recently, being a neophyte, is that it seems that you know all the concepts or ideas in philosophy, it never is arbitrary. It doesn't just come sort of Deus ex machina out of nowhere. It does have a history. And where would you, so if again, apropos philosophy of mind, where would you, is there a starting point where at one point in the history of human, let's say human knowledge, people started getting interested in this topic, or has it in some sense been the ultimate question, time immemorial, ever since the dawn of consciousness, let's say?
Which question specifically you're referring
Let's talk about philosophy of mind for
to?
starters. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think I came. I don't know if you say I was gonna say I want to say pre-Socratics, but I think maybe shortly after the pre-Socratics with Plato, um, because with the pre-Socratics you see some pretty heavy metaphysical stuff going on, but it's mostly like is the world made up. I mean, Democritus with the very early atomic theory. Is everything atoms in a void moving around, or is everything water? Is everything fire? So you have this idea of like monism in the
Yeah.
pre-Socratic,
So,
and
sorry, maybe because that's the top, that term is quite a loaded term. So monism is the idea that, well, actually, I'll let you explain, Jacob, please, if you could explain what monism is. Yeah.
so the term just signifies the idea that everything is one, or everything's made out of one particular type of
There's no
stuff.
duality.
Yeah. And that, I guess that's just one way of putting it too, because I mean, I'm saying things are made out of one type of stuff, so I'm kind of implying that we're talking about substance-based philosophy, substance-based metaphysics, where like the pre-Socratics talking about different types of material that things might be made of. Um, and then, I guess that kind of leads into a little bit of philosophy of mind when you get to Plato and talking about the ideas and talking, theory of forms and stuff like that. And so, yeah, I guess philosophy of mind really came about around the time of Plato. I mean, I'm not a great historian of science, so somebody might be able to correct me on that. But
Oh, better than me, mate. Better than me. So it's something I've always wondered where initially the idea came from, or was it more like the uh, Aristotelian way where people, instead of focusing on philosophy of mind, humanity or human beings were more focused on, let's say, the physical world, the way a scientist would be. How do things move, causality? But I'm coming to realize perhaps it was the other way around. Even before people were interested in the physical world, it was more on the world of mental constructs, even things like ethics or metaphysics. And it maybe we could get into, a few of your writings as to that shift where now it seems people are more physicalists over, let's say, idealists, and why that change has taken place. And then in your paper, where you talk about meaning, sorry, the ontology of meaning, one of your papers, you kind of discuss what the, let's say, the social consequences of that could be. But anyway, I don't want to get too carried away. Okay, now we get to the interesting stuff, with the fields that you're interested in, and this is what really drew me to your work. That's phenomenology and existentialism, or the way you put it, weird stuff. So, could you please explain in the field of weird stuff what that is, what those two terms mean, and I guess, look, anyone could Google what phenomenology or existentialism is, but maybe personal to you, how do you view it, and maybe juxtapose it with some other schools of thought in philosophy and science, to explain it, please.
sure. Before I do dive into phenomenology, I just want to place one little caveat on what I was just saying with regards to philosophy of mind, and saying that I was generally speaking of Western philosophy. I mean, if we start to look at Eastern philosophy, I mean, we're going to be able to look back, way before the pre-Socratic, into Hindu philosophies and different things like that to get certain ideas of. I mean, they had some ideas of idealism before I think any Westerners really did. So, we could look back in history much further if we were looking to the East as well. So I just wanted to make that point. So. Um, I didn't seem
No, no,
ignorant to the other side of things there.
of course. Now, point well taken. Point well taken. Yeah, yeah, yeah. In fact, maybe now I need to kind of change what I said before, or yeah, like add on to it, because certainly in a lot of Eastern philosophy, consciousness and the mind, let's say, was a big part of, well, more than philosophical practices, more like spiritual practices, isn't it? But now we get to this is probably semantics, like how do we discern spirituality and philosophy? What's the what's the difference? But that perhaps is a whole other conversation.
Yeah. I mean,
No, but thanks
that'd be.
for, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say that'd be a big conversation just in itself.
No, man. Yeah, I'm hoping to in fact speak to John Mavecki, because he seems like the perfect person to discuss those nuances and subtleties between all these terms. Yeah, but saying that, so yeah, existentialism and phenomenology.
So phenomenology, I'll give a very brief, I guess, like formal description of it. I guess just trying to place it in history a little bit, because it's a relatively, I mean, when we're talking about philosophy, it's relatively new. I mean, early 1900s, late 1800s is when Edmund Husserl was working on publishing the first formal definitions and descriptions of what he took phenomenology to be. So, he's considered the founder of phenomenology, formally anyway. You can find threads of it throughout the history of philosophy. But yeah, so he published in the Logical Investigations, and then I think like 10, 12 years later in Ideas, kind of like almost like a got some guidelines as to what phenomenology is or should be. And very basically, it's the study of experience as experience. Um, and that doesn't say a whole lot, but it's really about taking your first person perspective, and kind of applying some rigorous analysis to your experience and trying to figure out what certain things mean, trying to make sense of things as you experience them, as opposed to kind of standing outside of your experience or trying to um, put the experience aside to get a more objective view of the world. Um, so it stands in direct contrast with things like empirical science. I mean, you're not going to find a whole lot of phenomenology there, except in neuroscience, and we can talk about that later. I actually made a note because I want to talk about that a little bit. Because in phenomenology, we're taking into consideration our feelings and our moods and our personal values and things like that as um, ways of understanding the world, you could say, whereas as guides to understanding the world. I mean, just for example, if we're talking about meaning, which I'm sure we will get around to it later, but I'll just make a comment here about it. I mean, if we're talking about meaning in life, um, if you take an try to take a scientific objective approach to that, you're not really going to be able to say what's meaningful to you, because you're going to be kind of prevented from considering um, your interests and your values and kind of some of the things that you're passionate about, the things that you're interested in life, the way you feel about things. And if you take all of that out of consideration, I don't know how you would calculate a meaning in life.
Yeah, of
Um,
course. Uh, so maybe one example I enjoy, I read somewhere, is to kind of maybe use like a analogy. I probably wouldn't even call this an analogy, because it's in fact what a phenomenologist would do. So as a phenomenologist, if I give you and I'm sorry to kind of put you on the spot here, but as a phenomenologist, if I give you a cup of coffee, what would you do if you're told, let's say by Husserl himself, a guy comes back from the dead, resurrects and tells you that study this cup of coffee as a phenomenologist. How would you do that? What would your process be?
well, so I guess it depends on whose phenomenology we're using. So after
Spoken
Husserl,
like a true philosopher.
after Husserl, kind of formally came out with the idea and it started getting, I mean, he got a lot of interest right away. I mean, it was a really, it's for such a new and kind of divergent approach to doing philosophy. It gained a lot of interest really quickly, but pretty much everybody who took over the approach took it over in their own way. And I don't think we could really say that anybody had the same sort of phenomenological method. I mean, Husserl had very specific techniques that he thought we should apply while we're doing phenomenology, like the epoche, which is just to like suspend or bracket what he calls the natural attitude. And that's just to say like the kind of the habitual way in which we interpret our experience. He said, let's just like put those aside. Let's ignore that sort of stuff and try to just pay attention to the experience as we're experiencing it and describe it as such. Now, you get it right out following that. You get Merleau-Ponty, a French phenomenologist, saying, in his preface to the Phenomenology of Perception, one of the most important things we learned about the phenomenological reduction, as Husserl described it, is that a full reduction is impossible because we can never get rid of all of our interpretive strategies. If we did, we wouldn't be able to make sense or describe our experience at all. And he's not the only one that kind of criticized that. I mean, Heidegger did to a much greater degree. Heidegger has a very specific concept of phenomenology, not necessarily in what he thinks phenomenology should study, but kind of the approach. He thinks that the approach should be a specific way. Like we're looking to derive specific truths about the world and the phenomenon in the world when we're using phenomenology. And so he's everybody, I mean, I guess all the phenomenologists are limiting in their views on what phenomenology should do. But I do want to say something about the way in which Heidegger defines phenomenology, because I think it's a very brilliant sort of description of it. And so Heidegger, when he's describing phenomenology and being in time, but also in the lecture course given a few years before he published Being in Time, and that lecture course is called The History of the Concept of Time.
Sorry, just to clarify, so Being in Time is Heidegger's magnum opus, right? We should probably put that out. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Jacob. Keep going. Yeah.
No, you're good.
Yeah.
Being in Time is what he's most famous for. Even though he wrote a lot. He has a lot of books. He has a lot of papers. His later work differs a little bit from his early work, but there's also disputes as to how real the turn is.
The later Heidegger and the early Heidegger, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm not really knowledgeable enough to comment on how different those two things are. I'm kind of working my way chronologically through some of his work. In Being in Time and his earlier lecture course, he describes phenomenology by going back to the ways in which the Greeks used the term phenomenon and logos. So he's kind of taking apart the term phenomenology and separating it, and looking to the Greek definitions of this. And in the book, Heidegger says that the Greeks understood the term phenomenon as this is going to sound very obscure and esoteric, but I'm going to give hopefully an easier to understand description afterward. But he says phenomenon is that which shows itself in itself. It's the manifest.
Typical Heidegger.
Yeah. And the term for the Greeks also carried connotation of like bringing something to light and illuminating. And then the logos, Heidegger explains, the Greeks understood by the logos something like discoursing, but not just dialogue and not just a verbal utterance, but it's more of a discursive communication that lets something be seen. And so you could think of the logos as words, whether uttered or written down or what have you, that point to something. They let something be seen. It's bringing something to light. It's bringing the phenomenon to light. And so if we want to understand this in a less obscure and difficult way than Heidegger likes to put things, we could say something like, the logos points to the phenomenon in such a way that the phenomenon becomes unconcealed, or the logos allows the phenomenon to come into view by lifting it out of experience in such a way that it can be seen. And so really it's almost like your words should connect with something that can be pointed out in experience, or can be shown in experience. And so we're not, and he contrasts this with the idea of free floating concepts and words and ideas. And by that, he just means something like, we don't want to abstract away so much from experience that we're just playing language games. We want our words to be able to meet up with experience in such a way that if I say something, so like in some of my papers about meaning, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to point to experience. I'm trying to point to particular experiences and particular moments in particular experiences where maybe someone might find meaning. So I'm not. I'm just trying to bring something into view using words and concepts.
I'm glad you said that, Jacob, because in one of your papers, I forget which one, you've sort of touched on this, but a question that came to mind was, so from the definition you gave, definition of phenomenology, how does that differ from, let's say, the empiricist tradition or the empiricist approach, which tends to be quite popular these days, especially in the world of artificial intelligence, where we think that our epistemology or our knowledge or our truths of the world is revealed purely based on empiricism, which is experiencing, measuring things, and that in some sense the mind is a blank canvas and the world just gives us information and input. So from the empirical approach, how does phenomenology differ?
So phenomenology is going to differ in the sense that, okay, so if we think about the empirical approach specifically as it pertains to the sciences,
Yeah.
we're trying to get a collection of experiences that kind of compile and point toward the same sort of thing in experience. Now, a major difference, I guess, is going to be what it is we're trying to discern in empirical science, as opposed to something like Heidegger's phenomenology or the way that I just described phenomenology. With a scientific empirical approach, we're usually looking at objects, and we're trying to figure out what sort of properties these objects have. And so, I mean, I guess physics or chemistry is a great example of that. And we're trying to see maybe how two entities interact with each other. And we're going to perform experiments to do that. And we're going to try to replicate the experiments. And we're going to try to not let our first person perspective influence exactly what we're investigating. So phenomenology is going to differ from that in that we're not collecting data and we're not measuring stuff. We're experiencing. We're trying to pay attention to the experience as it's experienced. So you're not going to measure your experience of meaning. Say you're going to more so if you're doing a phenomenology and you're trying to discern maybe what you find meaningful, you're going to more so reflect on maybe the way that you feel when you were participating in a certain activity. And from there, you might also start to look at the structures of the experience more so than just the feeling of the experience, which might be, what's involved in this activity or what's involved in this experience. What are the things that are essential to the experience without which I could no longer say that it was a meaningful experience? Those are the sorts of things that sort of questions phenomenology is going to ask, and specifically Heidegger, because specifically for Heidegger, he's wanting to discern the a priori structures of existence and experience, which is just to say, a priori meaning always already there. Like what's necessary? What structures are necessary for this to exist or for me to have this particular experience? Yeah, I guess I'll leave it at that for now, because otherwise I'm going to get into a really deep, or you can ask a clarifying question, because otherwise I'm just going to go on a tangent.
No, that was perfect, mate. I think in many ways you lead me to my next question. I mean, I thought we were going to discuss existentialism too, because obviously it's kind of the precursor, or not the precursor, but it's highly correlated to phenomenology. But perhaps since we're already on this topic, you see, in some sense, I kind of regret even asking that question, because I'm coming to realize that maybe it's not fair to ask questions such as, oh, what's the difference, or what's the stark difference between phenomenology and science? Because if you think of a field like, let's say, psychology or cognitive science, those fields have had a massive influence by thinkers like Merleau-Ponty or Heidegger, by phenomenologists. So, well, the question I was going to ask is, how does phenomenology, and I was also going to say existentialism, but we didn't get to that still. But let's just say, how does phenomenology differ from a more scientific approach? But maybe to make things even a bit more interesting, let's talk about, in fact, how does it relate to fields like psychology and cognitive science, where in the world of in the scientific approach, what we always try and do is remove the subject, so remove the subjective experience. But clearly, there are some fields, even within science, where you can't do that. You can't remove the subject from cognitive science or psychology. So maybe to make things a bit more interesting, how do they correlate? How do they connect to phenomenology? Those fields I mentioned.
Sure, sure. So I want to comment on cognitive science just a little bit first, and then I want to maybe dive into a little bit of neuroscience and how phenomenology might be related, because I presented a paper last year at a philosophy conference hosted by a university in the Czech Republic on this topic of phenomenology and neuroscience. But before I get to that, something that I really appreciate about cognitive science is that it really embraces the subjective experience, and like you said, you can't remove that from cognitive science. It's still have cognitive science necessarily, and I mean, so I think the most prevailing approach in cognitive science right now is 4E cognitive science, and that's just the four E's. I always forget one, but it stands for embeddedness, embodied, inactive, and like I said, I always forget the fourth one. I don't know why, but
I'll leave a little
lot of
little caption or whatever just for our viewers. All good. Yeah.
Have somebody place in the comment.
Annotate the video. Yeah. It's fine.
But a lot of those ideas really, I believe, have an inception in phenomenology. I mean, they're especially in Heidegger, with Heidegger's idea of being in the world, which we'll get to. But it's just this idea that there's a more holistic structure to the world and existence that we need to take into consideration when we're trying to understand things about the world and trying to understand things about ourselves and maybe the way in which we interact with the environment. And so I think phenomenology played at least a role in trying and getting a lot of those ideas going for cognitive science. Now, as far as neuroscience goes, Anil Seth. I'm sure you've heard of Anil Seth.
Yes, I have. Yep. He recently wrote quite a popular science book, right, on the brain.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And so he does a lot of work trying to map the brain correlates of certain experiences. So he's trying to see like what's going on in the brain at a given time when someone's having a particular experience, and he's trying to build that map out. And you can't build that map if you don't have good phenomenology, because if we think about it simply, as far as, okay, let's say brain region X lights up when I have experience Y, and let's say we can gather all the data we want about the brain structure, and we can reproduce it and map it as much as we want. But if we don't have a good description of the experience, we're not going to know what we're mapping this brain activity to. And so in order to have good correlative mapping, we have to have good phenomenology. We have to have like a good description of the experience. And we have to have people, the participants in the study that they're studying, trying to get this correlative mapping going, they have to be familiar with the experience, not only as it is experienced, but they have to understand what it is that the neuroscientists are trying to map. Like, what experience do you want me to have? So then I can tell you when I'm having it, so you can, mark down what's going on in my brain when I'm having that experience. And so you have to have a whole lot of phenomenology going on. Not only the person being the participant being able to recognize the experience and being able to communicate that to the researchers, but the researchers also have to have a pretty rich phenomenological description of what it is they want their participants to experience, and that way they know precisely when the experiences started, because there might be like a very important, as far as neuroscience goes, there might be a very important spike in a particular brain region that they are trying to map to a very specific, maybe milliseconds of an experience. And if you don't get that right, it's just not going to be correct. Your description is going to be wrong, and your correlative mapping isn't going to mean anything, because you might have one side of it, but you're going to be missing the other side of it.
But also, Jacob, what makes phenomenology even beyond, let's say, that, because see what we are talking about here, it's, how can I put this? So, oh, by the way, so the book Anil said, the person you were talking about, it's called Being You. So it's a very, I think it's a neuroscientific approach to experience. But what that got me thinking was, as you were describing things, we're thinking of very localized experiences. So like, here's this pen, it's a black pen. I'm looking at it. What's my, to use a term philosophers use, qualia, let's say, and which parts of my brain lights up. But when it comes to phenomenology, of course, we even go beyond that. We even go to what you write a lot about, which is meaning and kind of the questions that truly make us human in that sense, right? So, and is that where we could maybe connect that to fields such as psychology?
So I think, we could connect it there, but I think we could still even bring it back to neuroscience in the sense of, so I know there was some research done trying to map brain activity and experiences of happiness. And this particular study didn't even have a description of what a happy experience might be as experienced. And so that was one of the experiments that I pointed to in my paper, where I said, I don't, they admit that one of the more difficult parts of what they were trying to do is the phenomenological aspect of it. But at the end of the day, it's like, it doesn't really, that research can't really mean anything until you have, a good description of what a happy experience is. And it's very difficult to do, because obviously not everything's going to make everybody happy. We're going to have different, not necessarily definitions of what happiness is, although we might have that too, but different experiences are going to make me happy, and different experiences are going to make you happy. And that gets even more complicated when we start talking about meaning. But another good example of this in neuroscience is the flow experience. So they're trying to kind of map out what's going on in the brain when somebody has an experience of flow. And not only is flow, I wouldn't say it's a rare experience for a lot of people, but it's also not an everyday sort of experience for people. And so it can be a little elusive. And again, so I think when we're talking about something like that, we're trying to do some neuroscientific research about flow and the flow experience. We need to have good phenomenology, and we need to have good communication around the experience in order, I guess, really in order to have good research and to be able to expand our knowledge of what it is that's going on when we're in flow. I'm very critical of science for a lot of reasons, but I also think it's, we need science. I'm not a science denier of any sort, and I love seeing good research around these topics. It's just unfortunate that a lot of the research is just poor research, because they kind of shit on philosophy a lot. And phenomenology is a philosophical discipline.
Yeah, I think from what I read in one of your papers, you've even used this term. It seems like you're critical of scientism, isn't it? It's not science per se, where scientism is this, like, it's an ontology. The part replaces the whole. And in fact, I was watching this interview. Sorry, I'm going off on a tangent here, but that's okay. It's a conversation. I was watching an interview, and Slavoj Žižek said that the modern problem is, the ultimate questions: do we have free will? What is consciousness? Even questions pertaining to meaning. We've localized those questions to the scientific domain, where historically those things were normally answered by philosophers, and philosophers have the ability to pull from different disciplines and kind of connect them all together, where science, ipso facto by what science is, doesn't allow that. So it seems that scientism is the problem. And okay, I'm thinking, how are we going to do this? So I want to get to, because I think this perfectly connects to your not your paper, but the article you wrote on Epoch magazine, which was the structure of meaning and experience, rediscovering that which has been lost. That article, but we didn't discuss existentialism yet. So, since we're on the topic of meaning, maybe we could give like a bit of a prelude to what existentialism is and how that pertains to meaning, and then we'll get to your article. Because if not, I feel like we're going to get carried away. I also have a few more questions about Heidegger, but I certainly want to discuss what you've written. So Jacob, like maybe we'll start with existentialism, and then we move on to your article, if that's all right.
Sure.
Cheers.
So I understand existentialism as a philosophical study of the human condition, in all of its guts and glory. And I say that because a lot of existentialism is around kind of gutsy topics like death, and it can seem kind of dark, especially when we're talking about things like anxiety and dread and death, and but it's really it's an attempt to try to understand the human condition and in all of its facets. And I mean, so we have the human as the central subject, and not just like the biological human or the physical human, but more than that, we have the experiencing human. And so, I mean, we can see already how it can connect up with phenomenology nicely. But I mean, the existentialists are going to ponder questions like what does it mean to live and die? What should I be doing with my life? Should I act responsibly? What kind of freedom do I have? Do I have any freedom? What does death mean? Is there meaning in life? Is everything just meaningless? So I guess very, very human questions that most of us have probably thought about at some point. And it's approached in a rigorous manner, though. So I guess that's what makes it a philosophy, thinking about these things in a loose manner. So it's approaching these very human questions in a more rigorous manner.
Yeah, what's interesting is we've got colloquial terms such as uh, existential dread or existential crisis. It seems like those terms wouldn't even exist if not for the existentialists themselves writing about these topics. And what's, even within existentialism, it's starting from Kierkegaard to Nietzsche to the French existentialist, of course Heidegger. It's which is why, what probably perhaps what makes philosophy interesting. You can never say this is what existentialism is, right? It's the thinkers themselves don't agree with each other, and in fact people such as Camus, who we would think as an existentialist, rejected that term. But I think you put it best, Jacob. The way I think about it is that it's the ultimate human questions, leaving aside abstruse detached metaphysics and coming back to our human experience.
Yeah.
And that, speaking about experience, that leads us to your article. So I'll reread the title, The Structure of Meaning and Experience. By the way, not to flatter you too much, you are a brilliant writer, mate. I aspire to write like you one day, especially on such abstruse topics. It's well written. It's well written.
Thank you.
The Structure of Meaning Experience, rediscovering that which has been lost. So obviously I read the article, but let's say for anyone who hasn't read it, maybe give a bit of a summary of what you were trying to cover and convey in this article. Obviously all the links down below in the description, and this one's on Epoch magazine.
Yeah, so I will preface what I'm going to say with the very honest answer or honest comment that I'm a better writer than I'm a speaker. So if you're listening to this and I sound like I'm all over the place, I would ask if you read some of my papers and articles, it might make more sense. I could be all over the place when I talk. Okay, so anyway, in that article, it was one of the first articles. Well, I guess not one of the first, but one of the first that I published about meaning and meaningfulness. And I was really trying to work out in that article kind of what my own perspective was on it and how I wanted to communicate what I was thinking about meaning. Um, and so that I really like that article for that reason, because I think it's almost like a foundational piece of writing that shows me the direction that I need to go in to try to illuminate these ideas a little bit more. But in general, what I'm doing in the article is trying to go through and talk about where we can find meaning in experience as it's experienced. And so I'm not appealing to analytic arguments to try to convince you that meaning is real in that article, which is what a lot of analytical philosophy is. It's kind of creating a coherent argument to try to convince or persuade someone that something is true. And they're often very isolated. I try to take a holistic and phenomenological approach. And so I'm trying to point to certain experiences where I think people have found meaning, and where I have personally found meaning, and where people that I've talked to have said, yeah, I find this really meaningful. And trying to talk about the structures of that a little bit. And also illuminating those structures also means describing what's necessary in the experience, or what might be necessary in the experience for it to be a truly meaningful experience. And I'll leave the introduction to that at that, and then see what questions you might want to ask.
Sure. So, meaning seems again like one of those terms like consciousness, which is it seems to be a bit of a loaded term, isn't it? So what for you is a meaningful life?
So I like to, so like you said, it's a meaning is a very obscure and ambiguous term, and I like to link this back back to, was it Aquinas or Augustine? I think it was Augustine that said something about time. I know what time is until somebody asks me what it is, and then when I'm asked, I can't figure it out. I can't give a description, or I can't explain what time is. And
or you could say meaning is like pornography. You know it when you see it.
You know when you see it. Yeah, I mean, and actually, I think that's a great I purposefully did not give an analytic definition of meaning in that article, or really in any paper I've written, because I think giving a definition of it is kind of doing an injustice to it, because it's a sort of thing. So you have to experience it. So you know it when you feel it. You know it when you experience it. And so that's another reason why, rather than try to tell people what meaning is, for me, a meaningful life, and I will say that I relative, not subjective, but relative, and I think there's a very important difference. It's going to be relative to each of our personal existences, and that we find value in the things that make us feel purpose, the things in life that sort of vitalize us, give us vitality, give us almost a zest, a zest for life, that I like to point to as indicators of meaning. For me, a meaningful life is doing philosophy and writing, and having a few close friendships, and having a loving family. And I think all of these things are important for a holistic meaning. Now, in the article that we're talking about right now, I focused in on one type of meaning because I think it's the easiest to point to an experience, and that's like a passionate activity. So like I use the artist as an example in that article, but it could just as well be a scientist. It could just as well be a philosopher, a writer. I don't think you could put a limitation on what sort of activities are meaningful, because that would just be quite absurd. Because I'm sure somebody finds something very meaningful that I would absolutely dread doing. And actually, I know that's the case. And so it's going to be relative. So I can say what's meaningful for me, and I could say, I can try to describe what's meaningful for other people. not in the sense that I'm going to tell you what you're going to find meaningful, but in the sense that this person that has practiced a specific discipline, a specific art maybe for their entire lives, and it's kind of like what they breathe and live, and it's their guiding passion. Um, I mean, I think that's a very good indicator that they're finding something incredibly meaningful about that endeavor. Um, and meaning certainly is not the same as happiness. Um, there's a lot of times where I'm writing and studying philosophy where I'm not getting some sort of immediate happy feeling from it or pleasure out of it. Sometimes it's very difficult and frustrating, but there's maybe a transcendent value to, I guess I'm going to use a phrase that you used last time we chatted. It's soul edifying. You know,
Yeah.
it lifts the spirit in a way that is distinct from happiness and pleasure. But it's a passion. Um, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, because I mean, look, passions. It's an amazing. I in fact have a question, not pertaining to this article, but one of your other papers, where in fact you've used the word passion extensively. The title of the paper is. You said that this is going to be published soon in a. So sorry, let me read out the title first. Passion as a disclosure of meaningfulness in life. This hasn't been published yet, isn't it? You said it's going to be published in a journal soon.
So that paper is still in review. I have not gotten a communication as to whether it will be published or not. The um, ontology of paper meaning or ontology of meaning paper, that one's going to be published in Conatus Journal of Philosophy in 2023.
Sure. But maybe if people are interested, they could probably tweet at you if you don't mind, of course. And if they're interested in reading the paper, because I don't want to leave it because they're not published yet. I'm not going to share them publicly.
Sure. Yeah. If someone's interested. Yeah, I can't really circulate it until I really have a decision from the journal. But if anybody's interested in reading it or looking over it or discussing it, definitely reach out. I can send a PDF copy.
Yep, great. All right, so meaning, this probably leads us to a bit of a Heideggerian question. I was going to discuss Heidegger separately, but it's why discuss Heidegger abstractly? He himself wouldn't like that. Let's connect it to your work. You've said that we live in a techno-scientific era, and you said that we are attempting to take a view from nowhere in the modern world. And when I read that bit, I was even trying to connect that to kind of this modern New Age obsession with Stoicism, where it seems that everyone talks a lot about Stoicism being detached from the world. And I don't know if that tightly correlates to this idea of the view from nowhere. You know, everything is just a cosmic phenomenon. Nothing really matters in some sense, ultimately. So I'd place this question in two parts, Jacob. Firstly, ultimately, what was Heidegger struggling with? What was he trying to figure out in his work, and what were his concerns? For instance, like in the essay, a question concerning technology, essays like that. And the second part of that question is, from his work, how does that pertain to the question of meaning and human experience?
Sure. So there is very upfront about the question that he's asking, and it's what is the meaning of being, and that's so vague that nobody can get an idea of what it is until they've read the whole book, and then maybe you can understand the question after that. But he's really just asking, in what sense do things exist? I mean, that's kind of what he's asking. Maybe an easier way to understand the question. And so he asks this question, and he says that the tradition has really forgotten about being and what being is. And for Heidegger, and this is gonna kind of come back around to his approach to phenomenology, as far as the idea that he thinks phenomenology should discover or disclose the a priori structures of existence. And so being for Heidegger is synonymous with the a priori ontological structures of existence. So the structures of experience and existence that are necessary for us to be having the experience that we're having right now. And this is, so we can contrast this with science, most certainly, and also traditional philosophy, because traditional philosophy and science is kind of working in this subject-object sort of framework, and they're also working within mostly a substance-based framework. So we have a substance. So we have objects, and objects are made out of a substance. And what kind of properties do these objects have? And this is another reason. I mean, and this is the reason why he was so against Descartes and had a lot of criticism of Descartes, because Descartes is kind of perpetuating these philosophical assumptions that Heidegger thinks are completely unfounded, such as, I mean, what is it to be like what is the human person? And Descartes going to say this immaterial consciousness. That's the person. So we're a substance, where he's bringing us back to the substance-based sort of metaphysics. Heidegger basically says, no, this is all wrong. We need to look at being, and we can't look at being when we're trying to look at objects and their properties, because in order for us to even look at objects and their properties, so in a sense, in order to even have an empirical science that can try to discern properties of certain substances and certain objects, we need all these other things already in place, and that's what he's pointing to with the a priori structures. And so that's kind of what Heidegger is up to in Being and Time, really. And he's going to say, that we're sense-making beings. I mean, we make sense out of all of our experiences. And he goes through in very complex detail what these structures are, and kind of what the holistic structure of them is, and so we have feeling. I mean, we have Befindlichkeit, and that's one of the important things for my work that I take from Heidegger, is this idea that and Befindlichkeit is often translated as attunement. In the popular translation, it's translated as state of mind, but it's a very terrible translation because Heidegger wanted nothing to do with states of mind. And so attunement might be a better word for now. Some people like to use disposition, but it's really just the way you find yourself in the world. How are you attuned to the world? And it has connotations of feelings and emotions and that sort of thing. And so that's just one of many a priori structures that Heidegger is going to talk about in Being and Time.
And how does, okay, so first question is, we talk about Heidegger's idea that we are being in the world, and he's trying to make the statement that, in fact, before we even think of our states of mind, our conscious experience, there are all these other structures that presuppose all of that. For us to even ask that question, what is existence? What is consciousness? There are many other things that come before that. And is that what he kind of means by we are firstly, we're embodied beings, but we are also in the world amongst other beings?
Yes. So being in the world, and it's all hyphenated. So if somebody's listening and they haven't seen the phrase written out in his book, being hyphen in hyphen the hyphen world is one. And it's done that way because what Heidegger's trying to signify with that is a unitary phenomenon. He's trying to say all of this comes together. It's all codependent. It's an interdependent phenomenon. We don't first exist and then try to find the world, and our world doesn't first exist, and then we kind of come into it. But there's a interdependence and kind of co-manifestation of existence and what he means by world, and that's what being in the world is. And so it's a holistic and interdependent sort of thing.
So
Think, yeah.
if we look at how that pertains to meaning, firstly, this is something I've struggled with. For Heidegger, it seems like there's a world of facts, but for the world to become true, for those facts to have a truthfulness, it requires a Dasein, or a human being. Dasein is the term he uses. So then would he say that in some sense, reality truly became reality as we know it now, only after we came into being, we came to exist, and we were being in the world? Or is that something he doesn't really talk about too much?
So he doesn't talk about it a whole lot. There are some very, very difficult passages that are still disputed today, and that I've had a lot of fun conversations about these passages, because it's very difficult to try to discern what the heck he was meaning. He also uses the word world in 3 or 4 different ways in Being and Time, but he's very precise about when he uses them, and he even tells you beforehand, like, if it's in quotes, this is what it means. If it's capitalized, this is what it means. So he has a good system. He's not just erratic in throwing these words out there. He knows what he means by them, and he tries to convey to us what he's meaning by them. But to get back to your question, yeah, in a very real way, what Heidegger is saying is, reality as we know it, the world as we experience it, the world as we articulate it, whether that's in as facts or not, only has being. It only is when Dasein is. And the question arises, well, if all human existence was to kind of fade out overnight, would the world disappear, or would there still be the world, or would there still be entities, that sort of thing? And Heidegger stays true to the phenomenological approach here, and he stays true to it in some other areas as well. And what I mean by that is, he doesn't give a definitive answer. He kind of just says, well, if we're not here, we don't really know what would be here. So because phenomenology is looking to experience, he can't make a phenomenological judgment about that. And he is honest about that. And it's something that I appreciate about his approach, is that he doesn't overstep the limits of the method that he's using. And I mean, philosophy has argued about that forever, whether the world exists independently or not. And what Heidegger just says is, well, as far as our experience goes, and as far as the way we articulate the meaning of being only is while we are. And it's obscure, and it's sometimes frustrating if you want a concrete answer as to the independence or not of the world. But he just kind of then follows up by saying, well, if we're not here, we're not really going to know. And I don't think anybody's had an experience absent the world. And so I don't think anybody knows what the answer to that is. And so it's to me, okay, so to me, I appreciate the enigma. I appreciate the mystery behind it. Because if we truly can't know, maybe we can think through it and have a discourse about it, and it might be a very meaningful sort of thing to talk about. But because we can't know, we shouldn't pretend that we know.
Yeah. Or I mean, perhaps it even, in some sense, Heidegger probably wouldn't even like us just talking too abstractly about such things, given that, again, like you said, he would want us to stick to the phenomenological approach, where we're talking about structures of experience. And for starters, if there aren't any structures, there are some conversations we can't have. Whereas at one point it just becomes the term you used, which I know is by Wittgenstein, is language games. At one point, which is why sometimes I think of like all these pop philosophy or pop science ideas, like the many worlds theory or brain in a vat, or what else? Do we live in a matrix? They really seem like futile or even useless efforts or conversations to have, because again, it doesn't pertain to our palpable actual experience. It's just fully abstract. And again, nothing wrong with abstractions. Mathematics is fully abstract, but look at how useful mathematics is. But no, I get your point. I think you explained it quite well. So Heidegger's being in the world, Heidegger's idea of being in the world, how does that relate to what you discussed here? Firstly, meaning, and then, well, perhaps more specifically, human meaning.
Sure. Yeah. And so, and I will also clarify, since you added that caveat on at the end there. I really only talk about meaning in relation to, as it pertains to humans, meaning in the lives of humans. I don't know if I'll ever transcend that and talk about meaning as such. But yeah, again, maybe that's not a phenomenologically appropriate topic, because I don't know, outside of my human experience, I don't know what meaning might be. But so being in the world, I think it kind of at least starts to give us, well, for one, that's going to be a priori structure to having an experience of meaning. I mean, we're in the world, not in a sort of container-like way, like water is in the glass, but we're the world and us are co-constitutive in a sense, and we have to. Trying to think about how I want to phrase this. I guess we have to involve ourselves in the world. Like we're always being in the world. We're never abstracted away from the world, or else we wouldn't be living anymore. We wouldn't be an existing human being. So it's not that we're never not being in the world, but I think it kind of points to this idea that us and the world are closer than we think, and we're more interconnected than we think. And if we sort of explore, sort of explore the world and various involvements that we might have with it, we might stumble across something that we find extremely meaningful. And I think that's really the only way that we can discover meaning. I don't think we subjectively create meaning, but I don't think meaning is also just objectively out there in the world. I think it's a relational phenomenon. So I guess that the concept of being in the world also points to that idea, that it's a interdependent and relational sort of thing. And we might also, in the process, discover a lot of things that we don't like and that we don't find meaningful, or we find the opposite, or that we find meaningless. But I think that's also just to closer to what we find meaningful, because you don't really know until you have the experience. You don't really know until you involve yourself in the activity or what have you. And so it's an experiential, relational thing. And being in the world is kind of just a necessary structure for us to be able to go out there and try to find meaning. If we weren't being in the world, we were not existing.
That's well put. That is well. I think you hit the nail on the head there. So being in the world is in fact what's necessary to even discover meaning. Okay. Because another thing I realized was perhaps one of the most important things John Vervaeke did to the contemporary philosophical conversation is that he started asking the question from meaning of life to meaning in life. And Heidegger would probably fall on the latter camp, where what he worries about or his concerns are meaning in life. For him, meaning of life is, again, one of those useless questions.
Yeah, and Heidegger uses the term meaning a lot, but he generally what he means by that is generally the way in which I just used it, like the sense that something has, making sense of something. The German term that he uses a lot is Sinn, Sinn, and it can be translated as meaning, but it can also be translated as sense. So Heidegger doesn't really talk about meaning in life as much as like making sense of things in life and making sense of the world. And that's another reason why I thought that, because I think Heidegger gets a lot of things right. I think he gets a lot of things correct with his fundamental analysis, and it's very like the fundamental structures that he's laying out something seems true about them. And so, because of that, and because he doesn't really talk about meaning in life, I thought his framework would be a really great framework to take over and to try to talk about meaning from within that existential framework. Because it is phenomenological, it is an experiential sort of phenomenon. Meaning is, and so almost I guess taking what Heidegger has done and adding something to it is kind of what, in a sense, I'm doing.
Yeah. Yeah, like all great thinkers, isn't it? Because Heidegger himself, even though he was trying to subvert whole of philosophy, he still was working off Aristotle or Kant or some great thinkers of the past. Okay, so this I want to read out an excerpt from your essay. The reason being, I think the way you've put it here very much pertains to. So, firstly, this is a small statement you've made in regarding apropos time, and you've discussed how time would differ for a phenomenologist from, let's say, a scientist, and then you've quoted Heidegger in that statement you've made. And I think that statement itself is more of like a sober example as to it. It probably answers a lot of questions that we were discussing. For example, the difference between phenomenology and science, or if there is this stark difference, and then how that relates to meaning and whatnot. So, firstly, I'll read out the statement and then I'll ask the question. So here's what you've stated, Jacob. For Martin Heidegger, past events are always projected into the future, while also existing presently as having been. The future is not later than having been, and having been is not earlier than the present. What was having been arises simultaneously with the present and the future, and human being is always toward itself in anticipation of the possible ways of being. The Heideggerian concept of time frees the phenomenologist from thinking of past, present, and future as sequentially ordered groupings of distinct events. So saying that, how does a phenomenologist or a Heideggerian view time and meaning and how that pertains to a human being from, let's say, an analytical philosopher or a scientist?
Um, so a common theme in Heidegger is this idea of primordial phenomenon and
Okay,
derived
you may have to explain that term, primordial phenomenon. Yeah.
So basically what he means by that is the more basic, more fundamental structure, I guess, what you could say. And because it's a phenomenological structure, it's going to be an experiential thing. And Heidegger thinks that a lot of the things that we have theories for now were derived from something more basic that we had in experience. And time is one of them. And so, like the sort of everyday notion of time that we have, which I think at the end of that paragraph that you read kind of talked about it as far as like the sequentially ordered groupings of events, or so the idea that time, that there's a future moment that's past, that's coming into the present, and then it's going to vanish into the past and be gone forever. So that's sort of everyday thinking about time and clock time. Heidegger is going to refer to as vulgar time. It's a derived mode of time. It's not the primordial phenomenon of time. And so he's going to talk about this more basic idea of time, and he's going to call it temporality. So if I say time, let's think about our everyday understanding of time. And if I say we can think about Heidegger's idea of time, it might just be easier for sake of conversation. So temporality is obviously very important. He wrote a book called Being and Time. And so the second division of Being and Time really dives into the details of that. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I could, that I know the exact meaning that Heidegger meant with his concept of time or temporality, because it's very complex, very difficult. But what I can say is that the basic a priori structures that he lays out in his existential analysis each pertain to a specific aspect of temporality. So we have understanding as an a priori structure, along with attunement, which I talked about a few minutes ago, and he also has fallenness or discourse. And basically what Heidegger says is that those three things come together to form the structure of disclosiveness, the way we disclose the world in a basic way. And each one of those pertains to a certain aspect of time. And so we have, we're kind of thrown in the world. We kind of find ourselves in the world. And we have a past that we didn't really choose for ourselves. And we have the way we find ourselves in the world, Befindlichkeit, or attunement, kind of the way we're currently attuned and dealing with the world. And that's kind of going to point toward the present. And then understanding is pointing toward the future, because understanding, and this is not going to be, it's not a cognitive thing. I mean, Heidegger will say that because theories of cognition are going to come after this. So again, we're talking about the a priori structures that are required for us to even be able to make up a theory of cognition. And so he doesn't want people to conflate what he means by understanding. And he gives very specific definitions to all of his terms. And sometimes it's confusing because we all think we know what we mean by understanding. So we might get confused there. But through the structure and through understanding, we find ourselves amongst a whole lot of possibilities, and we're constantly projecting ourselves toward those possibilities, whether we know it or not, whether we're aware of it or not. And it can be mundane things such as if I stand up right now and I go to walk to fill my water, I'm going to be using the door handle, and I'm going to be doing a whole lot of things that I'm not really thinking about doing. But those are all possible modes of comportment, possible ways that I could comport myself right now. So I'm constantly projecting myself into the future. Now, to try to give a better example of these three modes come together, maybe we could talk about the artist.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, so the three modes, okay, how about we try to use the example of the artist to expound on what temporality is and expound on what Heidegger means by time, but then maybe break down those three modes apropos the example of the artist.
So let's assume that we're talking about I'll call him a master artist, somebody that's practiced for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. Something they've been doing their whole life. They've built up certain habits, right? I mean, you don't get good at something, you don't learn how to paint, you don't paint your masterpiece first having spent decades of time practicing, making mistakes, and so on. During the time that you're practicing something and you're trying to master something, you're doing that. I mean, so let's say somebody's practicing right now. They're practicing their skill in some art, painting. Um, and in a very real sense, the future is co-arising. And the way in which it's co-arising is they are cultivating an ability to do something. They're expanding the horizon of possibilities that they can project themselves upon. So through the present moment, the future is co-arising. And let's say after they moved in, they've practiced. Now they're the master painter, and they're creating a masterpiece. In a very real way, their past is co-arising with them at that moment, in the sense that they have these techniques, and they have a habitual way in which they use the brush to stroke the canvas, and they wouldn't have that without their past practice and discipline. And so the past is with them at every moment. The past is with us at every moment, in the present moment, and then their future continues to co-arise because they're one brush stroke, two brush strokes. It's not their masterpiece yet, but in the process, the future, which will be their masterpiece, is co-arising, being made possible through what they're doing right now. And what they're doing right now was only made possible because of the past, which I'm saying the past, but I'm also saying it's still with them because it must be, or else they wouldn't be a master. You can't be a master at something unless you have gathered up with you years and years of practice. You're bringing all of this together in the present moment, in a sense.
Which is why you say that it's not. In fact, let me read out a small excerpt here. You say that during meaningful experience, this Heideggerian temporality displaces the vulgar understanding of time, for the latter loses its significance when human being is immersed in the world through passionate, skilled, and creative activity, or during being with others. So the point is, it's, to put it very, very colloquially, you say, I'm in love with a beautiful woman, or when I'm in this, let's say, flow state or whatever, you lose track of time. Like, I don't know where time goes, and this is the kind of time that you're saying Heidegger is talking about, not time in a linear sense where it's t equals 0 and then it goes on from there. And it's hard for us to, because it's what's interesting about what I realized about Heidegger is that once you get it, you get it. And like, oh, it's obvious what he's talking about because it's part of our experience, isn't it? But getting it is the hard part because we are so we are so trained, or we're so let's say attuned to think in a different way. So
Yes.
that's
Yeah, no, I think, and that's the beautiful thing about good phenomenology, is that when you get it in a different way than you get a proposition that you're struggling with. Maybe you're struggling with this analytic proposition, or this argument, and eventually maybe you work it out, you get it, you understand it, and you're like, okay, cool, I get it. But with phenomenology, I mean, a lot of times you do have to struggle with it. You have to struggle with Heidegger. I struggled with him for a very, very long time before I understood anything. But once you get it, like you said, because it is a part of our experience, you're not just affected cognitively or intellectually by the understanding is deeper than that. The understanding, I mean, it feeds back into Heidegger's basic structure that he's talking about. I mean, you feel it, you feel attuned to it. You say, oh my goodness, like I can see this in my experience. Like how did I not notice this before? Because again, he's trying to point to themes and experience, and there's something very powerful about that, in my opinion, over and above something that's just propositional that you can't experience for yourself, or you can't notice or reflect on and say, yes, that is a part of experience.
And it's not surprising that the existentialists, Sartre, or de Beauvoir, or Camus, were all heavily influenced by Heidegger, because that was the question they too were trying to deal with. The philosophy they were trying to develop was, well, the word itself is existential. There probably isn't any other word to describe it. Fantastic. That was a great explanation, especially I like the analogy of the artist. In fact, all great Heideggerian teachers, or teachers who do teach Heidegger, they like, the person that comes to my mind is one of my intellectual heroes, Hubert Dreyfus. It's how beautifully he first of all, he's thinking live, he's thinking out loud, but also he always tries to connect it to a phenomenon, something that's palpable in our lives. How are we going with time, Jacob? We're about an hour 20 minutes into the podcast, into the episode. Can we do a few more minutes? So how are you going with time?
I'm good on time. Either talking to you today, or I'm reading and working on the dissertation. So I have, as long as you want.
Perfect. I appreciate that, man. I mean, look, I was thinking, as we did discuss before we started recording, I don't think we can go through all the questions, everything you've written, especially probably the paper I like the most by you, the reinstatement of existential meaning, or passion as a disclosure of meaningfulness in life. That seems perhaps a very contemporary topic to want to talk about, because passion seems to be something we talk about a lot in our culture these days. So it'd be interesting to think of that in a phenomenological approach. However, saying all that, I would probably leave that to a whole other episode. So let's get to the one that you said is a good starting point to your work, which is your paper, Ontology of Meaning. So a lot of questions that I've written down on this. We touched on a lot of things. We spoke about phenomenology for sure. How about we talk about something a bit interesting? Firstly, let's, like we did with the previous paper, let's just get what you were trying to convey in the paper. So what did you mean by ontology of meaning? And after that, I want to talk about authenticity, because it seems like this idea of, just like there's this cliche corporate words like bring your authentic self to work, or be authentic online. And it's perhaps worth diving into what is authenticity from more of an existential phenomenological approach. But sorry, I'm getting carried away. Before we get there, your paper, Ontology of Meaning, what's the paper about? What were you trying to convey? And also, if you could please, where can people find the paper, either now or in the future?
Sure. So that paper will be available hopefully in first quarter of 2023. That's what I was told the anticipated publication date is. Basically, they just have to do some formatting and just wait for the next issue to be published, and it should be out there at the Conatus Journal of Philosophy. So in that paper, so it's very apparent. I think, is it in the title, Ontology? I wrote that paper so long that sometimes I forget what the heck
I think
said in
I
the
made a
title.
mistake, because the paper, in fact, I made a mistake when I read out the title. The name of the file was Ontology of Meaning. However, the title of the paper itself is Reinstatement of Existential Meaning.
Yes, okay. So it was originally going to be named something about ontology of meaning. As I was actually playing more into the philosophical tradition than I wanted with that, with what I was starting to convey in that. And by that, I just mean, so kind of the traditional idea of ontology is going to be very different than Heidegger's concept of ontology. By it.
Yes.
And I won't go into the details of it too much, but generally in traditional philosophy, ontology is almost like you can almost take like an inventory of the world. So you have one category, broad category metaphysics, um, and then a step up from that, maybe you have ontology, depending on how you want to define it. Everybody kind of seems to play with it a little bit differently. And um, in any case, I'll just move on because, like I said, I fixed the title right before I submitted it because I was like, man, I don't want, you start to notice your own mistakes sometimes as they're happening.
So you're saying that you don't prefer using the term ontology because you don't want to mislead the reader as to what Heidegger means by ontology. Is that why you wanted to change the name of the paper?
Yeah, that's ultimately why I did end up changing because, well, and also because I was kind of thinking about it in a more traditional sense, almost like meaning was a specific type of thing, but it's not a thing. Like meaning is not a thing. Um,
Absolutely.
Giving that, I was kind of implying that with the title, as far as the traditional understanding of ontology goes, and I really did not want to give that impression or implication that I was trying to call out meaning as a thing or an entity. Because I most certainly do not think that. But in any case, so in that paper, I was really um, I was trying to get across and how we might be able to begin thinking about meaning, and more importantly, where we, well, I guess less about where we might experience it and more about how we should be thinking about meaning if we want to actually talk about it in a genuine manner. And I say this because, and I'm pretty sure that's the essay where I talk a bit about science and talk a bit about law. And I try to, I mean, it's really quick. I didn't have a lot of space to do this, but I try to point out the reasons why they're the wrong frameworks for trying to discover meaning and talk about meaning. And why I did was um, specifically with scientism, but with really any reductive, any science that's reductive, you have this idea that um, everything can be reduced down to a certain thing. So like we can reduce things to a physical substance, things to chemistry, or we can reduce things to our biology. And you pair that reductive approach with scientism, or the idea that we're and then just place in physics or chemistry or biology, you're gonna you're there's no meaning anymore in that worldview, and meaning is considered non-existent. It's considered unreal. It's considered at best an illusion, or some subjective manifestation made up by our minds, as opposed to a real phenomenon. And so that paper was really trying to get that idea across, and to try to point to phenomenology as a legitimate alongside logic and science for understanding the world. And I argued for sole phenomenology, like only phenomenology approach, but phenomenology and the other things, because if ultimately I think a holistic approach is the best approach if we want to understand as much as we can. And so by placing phenomenology aside, things like science and logic, for as tools for understanding ourselves in the world and reality, and by saying ourselves, world, and reality, I really just mean everything. I just mean everything, our experience, the world, the cosmos,
All of being.
all of being.
Yeah. This is,
But
I'm glad we're talking about this. Perhaps before we get to sorry, did I interrupt you, Jacob? I think you were not done. We were done. Okay.
no,
Apologies if I did. Sometimes the connection, there's a bit of a lag. But okay, so this is interesting because you've said here, I wanted to ask from you, and this is very, very important, I think, because now, again, going back to a point I made before, it seems like science has taken the place of philosophy, and I think that's to our own peril. And you've said here, science is reductive, so it attempts to describe meaning, experience, whatever, in a reductive sense. And then you've said it's trying to take a view from nowhere. However, this got me thinking. You made a really interesting point in your previous article that we discussed, and I'm going to read out an excerpt where you've said it, you put it this way. You've said, so this is apropos this idea of science trying to be objective and taking a view from nowhere. You've commented on something by Ponty, by Merleau-Ponty, where you put differently, and as Maurice Merleau-Ponty made explicit in his preface to Phenomenology of Perception, this is really important what you've said here. The third person perspective of science is only made possible through first person human experience, because we only achieve a third person perspective via a collection of first person human experiences. The subjective first person experience then is something that is both pervasive and inescapable. So this got me thinking, is it even possible for science to ever be objective? Can we have an objective science in the sense of, can we truly, given that we are Dasein, we are being in the world, have a view from nowhere?
No, I think it's a myth. I think at best we can have intersubjective knowledge, and I think that's what most people, um, not that they mean, not that they know that they mean this, but when most people say objective knowledge, what they're pointing to is intersubjective knowledge. Because yeah, I don't think there's any way to get around what Merleau-Ponty pointed out in the preface to his book. There's no way of getting out of it. There's no way of getting around it. We had That's all we have. And so, if we're going to collect up a bunch of subjective experiences, and call them objective, what we're really pointing to is intersubjectivity.
So a scientist would probably try to challenge you on that point or counter that point, saying that, oh no, in the scientific approach we have the double blind study, or we have rigorous empirical research where, when you present a paper, or when you have an hypothesis, it's picked on by many other individuals, well, not individuals, let's say experts in that field, who try and break down your arguments, break down what one has asserted. And then where this excavation, where this breaking down or destructuring of an hypothesis, if that proves the falsity or the truthfulness of a certain hypothesis, and a scientist would try to counter you, saying that eventually, as we keep doing this, we get to this, to put it plainly, view from nowhere, or an objective approach. So how would you respond to that?
Um, I guess I would respond by asking, maybe a little bit of information about each of the experts in the field that was trying to check over the work and get and see, or, see if it works or not. Because I think by doing that, very quickly you get to the idea that another person, this is another Dasein that has a perspective on the world, and so we're collecting his perspective and this, and we're collecting the next expert's perspective on this. And I guess I would conclude by asking where is, because if there is a view, it's a view from somewhere. A view implies viewer. You can't view something without a viewer. To have a perception, there must be something perceiving, and so that to further imply perspectives. And so I think it's not. I'm intersubjectivity. I know some people are opposed to it and they want something more objective, but I there's no reason to believe that there's anything as such, because everybody who's ever said that is saying that from their given perspective. So it's almost like a performative contradiction in a sense. Like if you're going to argue for a view from, you can't actually show the view from nowhere. And if you, to have a view is to be a, to experience something is to be an experiencer. Um, then I think it's just, you get, um, and so I guess, yeah, I guess I would just try to respond in that way. And then if they combat and push back, then I'm not much of an arguer. I don't like arguments and
Oh, fair enough, man. I tend to be
confrontation.
quite, you and I probably are a bit different on that because I tend to be quite confrontational with these things. Yeah, because it is interesting because even at like leaving maybe at a bit of a higher, more of like a cultural level, we have a lot of these things, you know, even in politics or whatever, people say, I speak the truth, unbiased facts. I throw facts at you, or what's this by the Ben Shapiro guy? Facts don't care about your feelings, all these such things. But it seems like people don't even question the words they use, as in, what do you mean by facts? What do you mean by truth? And it even gets to the idea of, you know, what Kant tried to describe in his Critique of Pure Reason. There's noumena and phenomena, and there are certain things that we can never experience. They're more like a priori concepts, and it does. But then I don't know. But then I wonder if like a Heideggerian would ask, oh, in fact, no, the noumena itself doesn't exist without someone being able to view it or perceive it.
Yeah,
Seems
so
like
there
an unanswerable question.
that yeah, I think uh, so. For Heidegger, there's no two world model. I guess I always refer to like Kant's distinction there, two world model, because you have things and they appear in a certain way, but then you also have these things behind them, and that's like something else, and you can't get to that. You can't get to that. So I refer to it as two world model because you have the appearances that you can get to, and you have this hidden world that you can't get to.
Yeah.
And Heidegger has a single world model.
Yeah, he was very much opposed to the Cartesian approach in that sense, wasn't it? Okay, here's an interesting one. You've spoken about authenticity in your paper, Ontology of Meaning. Oh, sorry, not Ontology of Meaning. You've spoken about authenticity. You've spoken about authenticity in the paper, the Reinstatement of Existential Meaning. I know I read that out a couple of times. It's just to clarify what we're referring to. So when it comes to the topic of authenticity, it's something we hear very much it's quite pervasive. We hear it quite a lot in the contemporary online conversations. As I said, a lot of corporations talk about bring your authentic self to work. For a Heideggerian or a phenomenologist, what is authenticity? And perhaps more importantly, how is there a distinction between, let's say, Sartre's view of authenticity to what Heidegger talks about? That is, if there is a difference at all.
So Heidegger's understanding of authenticity is going to be related to, we talk very minimally, but I guess maybe we talked about enough, possibilities. And we're always projecting ourselves
We
onto
did talk about that,
possibilities.
yeah.
And so Heidegger thinks that, okay, so let's talk about inauthenticity first, because it'll be easier to get to authenticity, because Heidegger thinks that we're all of us are most of the time living in an inauthentic manner. Now, Heidegger doesn't place any judgments on authenticity or inauthenticity. He's just kind of saying, like, this is the way I'm describing things from this phenomenological approach. So he's not saying that one's good or bad necessarily, but of course we all have connotations associated with those terms. So by living inauthentically, basically what Heidegger's talking about is we're in a fallen mode of being, and that's always a possibility for us. Um, and really, what that just means is we're absorbed. We're absorbed in das Man, which can be translated as the anyone or the they.
They, yeah,
And that's just, it could be anyone. It's kind of like group thought. You can think about it as like group thought, group thinking. It's kind of the way. So if you come across phrases like "this is what one does in this formal setting," like that's another. You get, if you hear that, everybody comes into that at some point, whether you're going to school or you're going to a restaurant. There's like, you behave in certain ways and you don't behave in other ways. And most of the time, I mean, a lot of times that's good. I mean, we have to have these cultural structures in place, or else things would just be chaotic and hectic, and nobody would get along at all, and everything would be a mess. So it's, a lot of the time it's not bad to be inauthentic, um, but if you're just always inauthentic, then what you do and the possibilities that you project yourself upon and the understanding that you have of yourself in the world is given over to you from from the group thought. You're not taking anything up as your own. You're not reflecting on things from your own experience. You're accepting what they say and you're doing as they do. And if you're doing as they do and you're accepting what they say, that's why it's called, sometimes translated as the anyone, because it could be anyone. You could be anyone. I mean, you are anyone at that point. There's really no individuation between you and someone else if you're both functioning in that sort of mode all the time. Um, and so that's just, I guess, a very crude way to describe inauthenticity. Um, and so to project yourself authentically, to I guess even become aware of your authentic possibilities, um, you have to, in a sense, distance yourself from the world of the they, from the anyone. You have to sort of quiet the group thought and the group chatter. Um, and Heidegger says that, he says one way of doing that um, is through. I mean, actually, it's so this is where his concept of angst and anxiety comes into play, because he says during these experiences of intense angst and anxiety, you almost come into contact with and experience nothingness in a sense. Um, and this is more akin to, I think, maybe what we would call it in contemporary, like severe depression rather than just anxiety. Um, and so if you think about the severely depressed, they're almost in a sense living in a different world, in the sense that they're not making connections in practical references as they would in their everyday life. Like things don't necessarily, things kind of like they begin to fail to make sense. And it's difficult for you to do very basic, practical, everyday things if you're severely depressed. And anybody who's had these experiences can probably relate. I've had these experiences throughout my life. Um, and the reason um, why this might get you toward authenticity is because during those experiences, the the world is quiet, in the sense that you're not just running from one thing to the next, into the next, into the next, as the public interpretation would have it. Or you're not just doing as one does. You're probably just sitting in a room by yourself and not knowing what to do or what to think. Um, and so that's one way that Heidegger will say you can distance yourself from public opinion and public chatter and public interpretation and understanding if you experience this. And I guess on the other, the next step of that is realizing or coming to terms with your own death, and kind of reflecting upon your own death, because Heidegger says that that's the only truly that's the only truly self-owned possibility, in the sense that it's your possibility and it's no one else's. Nobody can die for you. I mean, if they die, you don't die, so they're technically not dying for you. Nobody can take over your death. When you die, it's you. It's your. You have to die the death, or you're not dead. And Heidegger talks about this as he talks about death as the impossibility, or the possibility of the impossibility of existence. Again, because he's staying true to the phenomenological method. So the possibility of the impossibility of existence. Because Heidegger is not going to say what he thinks happens after death, because he hasn't experienced it, and it's not a phenomenological thing to talk about. And so he says that it's possible that when we die, maybe we won't exist, and that's kind of where he leaves it. But by coming to terms with this in the way that Heidegger describes, which is essentially it's my death and it's my own and it's nobody else's death, that's the first glimpse of what he's going to say, what he's going to term authenticity, because it's my own possibility. Okay, well, if this is my own possibility, maybe I have other possibilities that are my own, not anybody else's. Maybe what might those possibilities be? And then maybe you can start to think about how you want to live your life, rather than how they want you to live your life. And you can begin to construct an existence in the way that you would like, as opposed to the way that they would like. And through doing that, you begin to reveal authentic possibilities for yourself that you can project yourself upon, whether it's taking up a certain discipline, or for me, it was doing philosophy. I actually started my formal education in a different field, and really loved philosophy, but everybody said that's what I should not be doing in a formal setting. I should get educated so I can make money. And I did listen to what they said for a very long time. And eventually I said, you know what, I'm just going to do this. I can't stop reading this. I can't stop thinking about this. I'm obsessed with philosophy. I don't know. I don't know if I can force myself to go to school for anything else. So I'm just going to do it. And so I guess I like using that example, because it was very obvious to me that I was being directed by popular opinion and what they think I should be doing. And then when I took over my existence as my own and whatnot, then I started to reveal these authentic possibilities for my existence. And so really what authenticity for Heidegger means is comporting yourself in a way that is unique to your own existence, and in such a way that you've chosen those possibilities, you've taken them over as your own. And so responsibility comes in here, because if you're just doing whatever you want on a whim, that's not a very great way to live either. You might think you're being authentic, but you really don't have a self at that point. I mean, you're not cultivating anything in any real sense, and so maybe you're doing what you want to do, but you're not manifesting an authentic self in the way that Heidegger would say that you need to if you're going to be authentic.
However, does Heidegger place any moral judgments on the concept of authenticity itself for a Dasein or a human being, in contrast to, let's say, someone like Sartre, who does seem to, he calls it bad faith to be inauthentic, who does seem to place some kind of moral judgment, despite him not being a fan of moralism, into authentic experience. And I guess what I'm trying to ask is there even a difference between Heidegger's version and Sartre's version of authenticity?
I'm not incredibly familiar with Sartre's versions. I feel like if I don't want to say anything that Yeah, I guess I just I guess I want to refrain from commenting because I don't know enough to say whether or not they could basically be considered the same. The only thing that I will say is that I know Sartre did misinterpret Heidegger on a few things, and one of those things was the way in which Heidegger was using the term existential. And if we're talking about existential possibilities and how important existential possibilities are for Heidegger's idea of authenticity, and if Sartre did misinterpret Heidegger on that point, then I would think there would be a difference and maybe an important distinction to make between the two concepts of authenticity, but I don't know for sure for certain.
But does Heidegger himself place any kind of qualitative differences? I don't want to use the word moral. Let's say qualitative differences between being authentic and inauthentic.
No, not he doesn't, and I think the reason is because we, even if we're aware of our possibility for authenticity, and even if we're living an authentic life most of the time, we're still participating in cultural structures that would be considered inauthentic by Heidegger's thought on pretty much an everyday basis. And this isn't it's not a bad thing to be doing. It's necessary. We couldn't. I mean, we're taught when we're children to look both ways when we cross the road. It's what one does before they cross the road.
Yeah.
So even these very mundane things that you wouldn't really think about in this philosophical capacity would be lumped into this idea of um, things. So I'll term inauthenticity this way: things that we've taken over from history and culture and society, as far as ways to act and ways to think about things. And it's not a bad thing. I mean, I don't. I think we should all still look both ways before we cross the road.
Yeah.
Even though that's what's prescribed.
Yeah, another great example, Hubert Dreyfus, I believe it's Hubert Dreyfus, pretty sure it's him, he uses on the phenomenon is when you get into an elevator, the distance you stand from other people. And he says that that can culturally differ, in fact. So when you get into an elevator, some people don't mind being a bit too close to each other, whereas perhaps in Western countries, we would prefer having a bit of space and we wouldn't want to be too close to another person. Whereas, I remember growing up in Sri Lanka, if you even take public transport, the other guy is just breathing down your neck, right next to you. Whereas you wouldn't even see that here in Australia, for instance. Yeah, so and again, those just because we're a part of certain kinds of cultural practices does not make that is yes inauthentic, but I wouldn't Heidegger wouldn't say that makes you a morally inferior person. Or well, he doesn't make moral claims for starters, but he wouldn't even try to place any kind of qualitative judgment on it, isn't it?
Yeah,
Right?
and so sometimes there's, I mean, the terms are so they're translated as authenticity and authenticity so much that I think it would be difficult to get away from that particular translation of them. But um, another possible translation of the term that he uses in German for authenticity, I mean, you could translate it as ownedness, or so it could be like something that you chose like in a self-owned manner or something like that. And so like inauthenticity, might be just it's a thing that you're doing that you didn't really you weren't the original agent to prescribe that or something. I mean, it's kind of difficult to talk about without just using the terms that are always used in the translations. But um, I feel like in the original language, it wouldn't have such heavy connotations as it does in Western culture, as far as like acting authentically is something you must do all the time and you must always avoid and be
Yeah,
inauthentic.
and the problem is again with authenticity or even passion, which we can get to hopefully in the next conversation, Jacob, is that it's a colloquialism. It's used, so it's pervasive colloquially, and it comes with a lot of baggage. So it's a bit hard to. Here's where I really wish that I learned. I could speak German. In fact, I'm trying to learn French to read some of the French philosophers, but maybe one day in life, who knows? Maybe even German. um, yeah, mate. So look, that was fantastic. I'm really feeling refreshed, and I would even say to a certain extent, I think I'm in the flow state right now. So I'm just really, really feeling it. I don't think we'll have time to go through your other paper, and in fact, just to give it the time that it deserves, I want to probably have a separate episode on that. We're coming to the 2 hour mark, or we've even crossed 2 hours now. Maybe to kind of as like a conclusive statement, more of just practical advice. As someone who studies philosophy, as a writer, I would ask you a two-part question. What advice would you have for people like myself, neophytes, or even just people trying to get into philosophy on how to study philosophy? And secondly, what advice would you have on writing philosophy?
Um, so as far as studying philosophy goes, it's always a good idea to have an understanding of the history of philosophy. That way, you kind of getting an idea of the history, you if you reflect on that sort of study, you start to come to certain realizations as far as maybe how one idea inspired another idea, and you also get an idea of what's been said already. So because so when you get into philosophy, sometimes it happens where you think you have a really cool novel idea based on something you've read, but then you realize that somebody else also said that like 1,000 years ago, and so of the history is good for that reason too. So you're not just you're not spending time reiterating something that somebody's already done 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. And it also gives you an idea that nothing is absolute in the sense that I mean you can see how much has changed over the centuries of philosophical thought, and I think that's good for the ego just to get an understanding that they didn't have the absolute truth. I'm not going to get the absolute truth, but we can think about these things and still maybe discern partial truths or something like that. I always like to have that in mind when I'm writing things or thinking about things.
So
And
any more like when it comes to your process of reading, writing, what's the how does it look like on a day-to-day basis?
Consistency and is I think what has helped me above all else. Like just reading a little bit every day or studying a little bit every day when you can. Like even if it's 20 minutes. So like a lot of times the first thing I do in the morning is I listen to a lecture or I listen to part of an audiobook or a podcast, where they're discussing certain things. Because that just really gets my mind going right away as far as thinking about these things. And the reason why I choose sometimes I'm too tired, like for the first hour that I wake up, that I can't really force myself to read, but I can listen to something while
Gotta
I'm
eat your
getting my
coffee stuff.
coffee. Yeah, yeah. I can listen and drink coffee. It's hard for me to read and make my coffee. And so I think repetition or consistency and just persevering. Like if you think you don't understand something, like don't just stop reading it. Just read it, even if you don't understand it. Just read it because you might start to understand bits of it after you're finished. And even if you don't, things might start to make sense maybe months later or something like that. That's the experience I had with Heidegger and Being in Time. I read it once and came away from it saying, dude, I don't understand literally anything this guy has said. But I feel like there's something really important here. And so I really dove into secondary sources and lectures and going through the book multiple times after that. And so I would say just read a little bit every day, read and make notes. Write in the margins of your book if you have a physical book. Don't try to keep your book super perfect and neat. Just start writing stuff down and highlighting stuff. If you have a question about something you read and it seems like it's a good question, write the question next to the paragraph in the book. I just doing small things like that has helped me a whole lot. Highlighting things you think are important, and then highlighting things in a different color that you just don't understand. Because you can go back through and you can. It has to be an active process, I guess. Maybe that's what I'm trying to get around to. It involves an active process. You're not just sitting there and taking in words that you're seeing with your eyes. It's an involved process of writing and thinking and reflecting, and don't be concerned with reading too quickly or saying it's taking me forever to get through these 10 pages, but it's going to take me a year to read Being in Time. Just give it the time. It will be quicker and easier to read, and I just like to take the approach of giving things the time that they ask. They're going to ask you for a certain amount of time, and just give it to them.
So do you normally pick a thinker and then study all of that thinker's work, the whole over of the thinker's work, or do you rather pick, let's say, like a fundamental philosophical text, like it could be Critique of Pure Reason or some of Plato's Republic, whatever it may be, and then focus on the text itself? Or are you more thinker focused?
So really it varies. I'm more thinker focused now than I have ever been, but previous to this, I almost always say I was thinking just broadly. Let's just say I was thinking about topics in philosophy of mind. And maybe I got intrigued by physicalism. Well, then I would go through and I would try to find what the history of physicalism was and like what the major thinkers through, and kind of like read along the concept or the theory from a variety of perspectives. And then I would really immerse myself in it and try to like think from that perspective. And sometimes you do have to spend a lot of time to like get, to use the Heideggerian term, to get attuned to that kind of mode of thought. Sometimes you have to spend more time. But I would, but then after that, I would read the opposite view, whatever the opposite view was. Not necessarily just arguments against whatever position it is, but what's like a contrasting theory or idea, and then I would dive into that. And so I did that. Honestly, that's what I spent my undergrad time doing, was just like kind of juxtaposing theories and concepts with contrasting theories and just trying to get a really holistic view of like why people think things. I don't have very strong opinions personally. It's easier for me to do that sort of study. I'm always very skeptical of everything, but also myself at the same time, and try to say, I mean, I can appreciate ideas that maybe I disagree with. And it'd be very difficult to say anything absolutely. I could always be wrong.
Well, it's interesting though. Like like you hear a typical trope by more public intellectuals is be skeptical, be open-minded, be critical, be objective, be rational. We hear all these terms thrown around quite a lot, isn't it? But it's also sometimes, I think, and again, I'm not trying to pick on a particular public intellectual, like someone like a Steven Pinker or Sam Harris, who constantly to almost like ad nauseum talk about rationality and reason and being open-minded and whatnot. They also don't seem to get it that, in fact, firstly, being skeptical, being critical it's a really difficult thing to do. It's in fact quite unnerving. It leaves one in this state of angst, and there's no stability in one's life. And it's if you truly authentically do it in a very genuine, sincere way, it can leave one unraveled, uprooted. It's not an easy thing to do. No wonder you see, it's like what Dostoevsky said. It seems that men with large hearts and deep minds seem to be the most miserable. And I think he says that in Crime and Punishment. I'm paraphrasing him. And then also comes the other thing where even these, again, what should I call them? New age atheists, or not new age atheists, like the new atheists. So again, public intellectuals. For me, all of their skepticism, it's not skeptical enough. They still
Yeah.
are very much a domain, their own domain of reason or whatever. It seems like they haven't explored many other areas that probably would even unravel them, because all of their work would also then deconstruct and break down.
And it's funny because that's not when you were talking specifically brought up. I know you didn't want to pick on anybody, but when you brought up
Yeah.
Sam Harris, I just thought, yeah, he's always talking about people should be skeptical, but I don't think he's skeptical about his own thoughts at all.
At all.
It's just that
yeah.
it's not he doesn't portray that, he doesn't give that impression. He doesn't question himself enough to for me to say, yeah, he's skeptical. I don't think he's very skeptical at all.
Yeah, because it seems that again, I don't know why. I guess this is very arbitrary. I just picked Sam Harris, but even Sam Harris, he has his foundational like axioms he works off. But within those axioms, he will question, he'll be critical, but he never tries to break down those axioms themselves, which is why I admire an intellectual like Heidegger, which is what Heidegger was trying to do. And that's yeah. I guess all I would say, Jacob, is firstly, thanks a lot, man. I truly am grateful. As I said, I'm a complete amateur, so it means a lot that you shared your work with me, even the stuff that you haven't publicly published, for me to go through and study. I haven't read the whole of Being and Time yet. I'm slowly working my way through it, plodding along, one could say. But it's a worthwhile journey. It's also something I've realized. I view it now more as, in some sense, as like a moral responsibility that I'm obliged to do this, that I should make time for it. And that means spending a lot of time in solitude, not really getting out. But the point I was trying to make is I think you're a great thinker. You're a fantastic writer. We didn't really get much into the writing, hopefully in the next episode, but I can't thank you enough, Jacob. It means a lot. You're a good bloke, and I'm looking forward to the work you do in the future, more of what you write. And when you do write when your Being in Time comes out, let's have another episode and talk about your magnum opus.
Sure, certainly. I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me on and chatting. And I'll just reiterate something I said earlier. If you guys want to read any of the papers and they can't find them or can't get a hold of them, feel free to contact me, and I'll be happy to copy over. And again, I'm a better writer than I am a speaker, so.
Oh no, man, you did great. Trust me. I am not good at neither. So you at least got one thing figured out, the writing. But cheers, Jacob. Just on that note, though, you said that your website was still under construction. So if I do leave a link to the website, it's probably not going to load. But is the domain going to be the same one, or are you going to change it completely?
The domain will stay the same. The website is under maintenance right now. I'm kind of revamping it to. I'm trying to provide resources and information about phenomenology and existentialism, and specifically meaning and meaningfulness, and just trying to provide a little bit of direction for people that are looking to read more about the stuff and study it. And yeah, so I can't say how soon it will be finished, but I would say it's not going to be more than maybe 3 weeks or 4 weeks from now.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'll try to get this up as soon as possible. In any case, I shall leave a link to your Twitter account or Twitter profile, and then if people do want to get in touch with you, they could contact you there. Correct?
Yep, certainly. Fantastic. Yeah, and I think I might even have a link to my website on if you don't put it on here or whatever, people can find it, I think, on my Twitter.
Perfect. Thanks, mate. Cheers. I shall stop recording now. Take care.